So if a man with high testosterone is in a scenario, let's say he wants to approach a pretty girl, maybe he wants to go rock climbing, wants to open a business, something with some risk and reward, that's going to be facilitated by the testosterone overshadowing the stress hormone response to allow for proper dopamine production. So there's a lot of stuff that's marketed and sold online as natural testosterone boosters. If it comes in a capsule, it's not going to work. The main thing that improves your natural testosterone production is the stuff that people don't want to do because it requires work. And I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I'm pretty far down the rabbit hole. Is I also think that there is an agenda to suppress testosterone and masculinity because it is the only molecule that's ever been studied in an interventional setting that has made people less compliant with conditioning. It makes less people likely to follow rules.
My guest for today's episode is Dave Lee. Dave's a holistic health coach who specialises in testosterone replacement therapy, men's fertility and men's mental health. He spends his time between Europe and Australia and is highly sought after for his extensive and elite level knowledge of male hormones and the endocrine system in general. So join us for this exciting episode where we delve into men's hormones, testosterone, supplementation of testosterone, how to raise your testosterone naturally, and then later on in the episode we talk about the war on masculinity. So if that interests you, tune in. When you give up the victim and you start taking responsibility for your own healing, you take back the power, and there's quite often we outsource our healing to someone else, and you became your own healer in that regard. You didn't like what you were hearing from the medical establishment, so you became the expert. You were the one you were waiting for.
Exactly. I was basically disabled. I couldn't walk without holding onto the wall, and over a period of months, it became quite psychologically distressing, and I got very dark quite a few times, and eventually I saw a fantastic practitioner in Perth named Stephen Hooper, who said, "Look, go to hospital and have them check for a nystagmus, which is where your eyes lag and delay when they move your head rapidly." And I had that quite severely, and they diagnosed vestibular neuritis. And they said, well, because the inner ear's nerve is so heavily inflamed and damaged, this is not going to recover or get any better. And that's it's not a nice thing to hear. You find out what's going on, which is great, but then you get told it's incurable, which is not so great. So it had been a couple of years at this stage, and I'd gotten very dark. It was very difficult to function spiritually. I'd kind of fallen apart a lot, and I was into fitness a little bit in the background, and I very quickly and reactively jumped onto testosterone replacement to see if it would give me any kind of help or confidence or fortitude in what I was going through. And that completely shifted my mindset. It made me go. I was very into David Goggins at the time. He just released his first podcast on Joe Rogan where he talked about his journey and his experience. And I went full time into rehab for about a year. So full time vestibular rehabilitation for a year, physical exercise, physical rehab all day, every day. And that took me back to university because I got about 90% better, but I couldn't recover the last 10%. So I went back and did a postgraduate diploma in science. My undergrad was in business. And I got about a month into my master's of neuropsychiatry and I dropped out because I wanted to learn how to heal the brain, not drug people. And I was looking at hormones more from a neuropsychiatric standpoint. What's it doing in the brain? What's the mechanism of action? What's the similarities between testosterone and SSRIs or dexamphetamine or these other medications that we use? And it helped me understand that not only did testosterone allow me to psychologically deal with what I was going through, but it physiologically also helped with nerve regeneration. So when I got through that and did a few extra tweaks at the end using some peptides and some other compounds to, heal it 100%, I felt like everything I was doing in my life up until that point, which I had my major in digital marketing, it felt very superfluous. It felt just like it wasn't worth my time or energy. I was really only interested in helping people go through what I'd been through. And during that time, I didn't have anyone. And I wanted to be the person I needed during that phase for other people. And right right after we met, I had some circumstances change in my previous employment where I was forced to go all in on that. And that was about 4 years ago now, and since then I've just written my third book, speaking at the Olympia for the second time next week on this topic, and become a bit of a global educator, authority, uh, recognized as quite a high level facilitator of this treatment in the space, despite not being a medical doctor. And that's been a very exciting and rewarding process because it gave purpose and meaning to something that otherwise would have caused me to adopt a victim mentality. During that time, it was very difficult realizing that I didn't have people around me who supported me. When you're dealing with an invisible condition, it's very easy for people to either not understand or just write it off as just someone who's lost their mind or looking for attention. And it wasn't until afterwards when people kind of realized what was happening that they were like, oh, that was quite severe what you'd been through. But I didn't harbor any resentment to anyone. I didn't have any kind of feelings like that because coming out of it, I was like, at the time, if you told me it was the best thing that happened to me, I would have told you to F off. But afterwards, coming out of it, I was very quickly able to realize that I'd gone through a very significant rite of passage in my life. And perhaps if I'd been through a rite of passage before, I would have dealt with it better. Because looking back, I was someone who couldn't handle those circumstances that life had thrown at me. So I just convinced and brainwashed myself that, the universal God or whatever circumstances put me through it for a reason because it or they knew that I could handle it. And that would allow me to protect and guide others through their journey. And whether that is or isn't true, it doesn't matter because that really helped.
And so you used testosterone replacement therapy to manage your vestibular neuritis that you got from your brain injury, your traumatic brain injury. And do you still use testosterone TRT?
Yeah. So I've been on TRT now for either 7 or 8 years, about 7, 8 years. And when you start testosterone replacement, because of the severe stress and psychological and physiological distress I was going through, my hormone system was completely destroyed. Cortisol, adrenaline jacked through the roof. My testosterone system was in the gutter. So once you start that treatment, especially if you already have hypogonadism beforehand, because you're creating this acquired hormone deficiency, I call it like type 1 diabetes of the testicles. You're becoming dependent on the exogenous administration of a hormone. So the longer you're on that and the longer that natural production is shut down, the less likely it would be to come back. So I will absolutely be on this for the rest of my life. Otherwise, I'll be in trouble.
Got you. Yep. Okay. When is it a good time for a man to use TRT, and when shouldn't you use TRT? I mean, that's probably a very broad question,
Mm.
but I know men are interested in this topic. And then I suppose it would depend somewhat on your levels. So could you talk about testosterone levels? And were your levels low when you started using? And depending on your testosterone levels, should you be using TRT or not?
Yeah, and this is one of the most important questions. So when I started this, there was maybe one book written on this. I had to find people in the US to guide me on it because it was a very niche subject. Now it's a bit of a buzzword, which I think is a double edged sword. I think it's great that more people are becoming aware of it, but I think it's also being used more recklessly and haphazardly. And it's a big card to play. It's the bazooka in the back pocket if it's needed, and it should be played when it's needed, but it shouldn't be played prematurely because it is a very invasive thing to do to the body. So I had very low testosterone levels at the time, and looking back on my early 20s, I probably didn't have good testosterone levels to begin with. And that probably brings me to my first point on this is that 10, 20, 30 years ago, low testosterone was the male version of menopause. It was the thing that happened when you got old enough, your levels declined. We call it andropause. And you would need hormone replacement therapy to restore the levels back to what you had when you were a healthy 20, 30-year-old. These days, the problem is that the younger generation are growing up with the testosterone levels of a 90-year-old. And it's pretty damn obvious if you look out at the average 19, 20-year-old these days. I went to my 10-year high school reunion and I graduated in 2009. And there's a group photo of the 100 to 150 kids in the year. And there was 2019, 2009, 1999, 1989. So all the kids in these photos were 16 or 17 years old. And the guys in 1989 looked like they could eat the guys from 2019 for breakfast. It was a completely different human. They looked about 5 years older and about 50 times more masculine. And I think, and there's no hard knowledge on this, it's all theories from people like myself, but we believe it's a combination of the pollutions, plastics, and pesticides that we're growing up with. And I think my generation was on the front end of that, as well as the new health conditions that didn't used to be an issue. Obesity is a huge problem. If you're obese during development and not going outside and doing proper physical activity, it's going to stunt the development of your hormone system for both men and women. And I think this is becoming a problem as well. So we've now got this myth where, well, if you're in your early 20s or your late 20s or your early 30s and you go to the gym and you eat well and you look after yourself, you'll have healthy testosterone levels. And this just isn't true. So a lot of younger men are going to the doctor or going to a counselor or a psychologist with a biological problem that's underpinning their psychological symptoms of anxiety and depression. So if someone is to go on TRT, it's important to look at both the symptoms and the levels, because the problem is the symptoms are very ambiguous. You can have a low libido and difficulty putting on muscle and excess body fat and depression and anxiety for a huge amount of reasons. Um, and that's why it's important that we look at the levels as well. But one of the issues that we're having now is that the reference range that we look at on the blood work is a calculation of the last 100 men who've had their testosterone levels checked with the mean and the standard deviation either side. It's not a reference range of health. And this reference range has declined drastically over the last 20 years. So 10 years ago, when I first got my testosterone level checked, the reference range for total testosterone was 10 to 35. Now it's 6 to 24. So if you were previously at the lower end of the range or the lower quartile, you're now in the middle. So if you go to a GP and he's not clued into this and he's just looking at the labs and he's going, well, your testosterone level is normal, there's nothing wrong with this. You can be hypergonadal, in the middle of the reference range these days. And unless you see a specialist, you wouldn't know. So I also think that the second problem with that is that, and I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I'm pretty far down the rabbit hole, is I also think that there is an agenda to suppress testosterone and masculinity because it is the only molecule that's ever been studied in an interventional setting that has made people less compliant with conditioning. It makes less people likely to follow rules. And if you remove people's capacity for operant conditioning, then they're going to be easier to control. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the main medications used for psychiatric disorders and low grade mood issues are things that increase operant conditioning, which are things like SSRIs and antidepressants. So it's a big card to play, but if men leave low testosterone untreated and it can't be resolved with diet and lifestyle, which should always be the first mechanism and interaction that we use, it's something that can rapidly accelerate physical and psychological disease states. And I think that it's something that a lot of guys are struggling with and don't realize. And that's why I'm such a big advocate of spreading this message that men should get their testosterone levels looked at.
So, if I hear you correctly, you're saying that testosterone levels in men are falling, and as those levels are falling, so is the reference range for normal testosterone decreasing. And so, a man of today is going to have a lower testosterone, but when he gets his blood work done, the reference range is also lower. So it may look like he's doing better with his testosterone than he actually is. Is that what you're saying?
That's absolutely correct. Absolutely.
And then you mentioned one of the reasons for decrease in testosterone being what's known as endocrine disruptors or chemicals, whether it's radiation or toxic chemicals or things that can get into our system and disrupt our hormonal endocrine system. So is that the primary reason for a reduction in testosterone in men?
We don't objectively know as fact. I think it is.
Mm.
I think that that's probably 60, 70%, and 30, 40% is the diet and lifestyle as well. But I think diet would probably fall into both categories, but lifestyle is definitely a big factor. Far less physical activity, far less sun exposure, far more low grade psychological stress. I think that's a big factor as well. But I would say what is doing the lion's share of that, and I think also that drives a lot of behavior as well. As someone who experienced low and high testosterone, it's not an intoxicant. You're still responsible for your own actions. but your disposition towards taking on stress and being resilient completely changes. And I think the endocrine disruption from what's called xenoestrogens, which are synthetic chemical estrogenic molecules that bind with the estrogen receptor at a far stronger potency than natural estrogens, men don't have the capacity to detoxify large volumes of estrogen. So when we're getting bombarded with this constant, just and even from birth, I mean, we're wrapped in plastic and polyester and synthetic things from birth. I think when you combine that with not only the lack of nutrition in the diet, but all the processed garbage which interacts with the endocrine receptors as well, I think it's where basically my generation is the downstream effect of what happens when you do that to a group of people and then they reproduce and then they reproduce. And I think we're looking at the multi generational downstream de evolution of the human race due to endocrine disruption.
And when you mentioned estrogen, you're talking about like plant estrogens in our diet. In particular, I believe soy is quite high in estrogen, and so that's going to block or decrease testosterone in a man.
So the plant-based estrogen argument is a little bit contentious. So the the external estrogens that we look at are phytoestrogens, which are like the plant food-based estrogens, and then we've got xenoestrogens, which are the chemical synthetic versions. The chemical synthetic versions are orders of magnitude stronger than the phytoestrogens. When we look at the phytoestrogens, they even seem to be weaker than natural estrogens in the body. So some people will debate and say that they are not problematic at all, that the phrase soy boy is actually a misnomer and it's actually not a problem with health. And then others will say that it's adding to the load of the total synthetic or external estrogenic chemicals in the body, and that's causing the issue. So it's kind of like saying it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. I think that it's probably a bit from column A and a bit from column B, but I would say that the synthetic chemical stuff, if that's not the primary issue, it's definitely the 60 percenter. I think the increased amount of soy and other crap in the diet is also not ideal, but I also do hypothesize that the primary issue with that is that maybe it's less so the soy itself and more the fact that it's replacing the actual nutritious stuff. So it's more about maybe what you're missing out on, as well as that's
Yeah,
also not helping the equation as well.
sure. You mentioned xenoestrogens, chemicals. Can you give an example of a xenoestrogen?
Sure. I like things in threes. So pollutions, pesticides, and plastics are the ones that I talk about. And so when we're
Okay.
looking at plastics, everything is wrapped in plastic, particularly things like BPA, but BPA-free plastic can still have endocrine disrupting effects. If we're looking at pesticides, particularly in countries like Australia, where they use a absolute metric ton of it due to the fact that there are so many insects and flies, food in Australia, grains and plants are very heavily sprayed with pesticides. Over here in the European Union, you can't buy glyphosate. You can go down to Bunnings in Australia and buy a bottle of glyphosate. You can't buy that here. It's government controlled. You say, I want a bottle of glyphosate, and they go, why would you want that? You can't have it. So over here, there's a lot more favoring of things like ecological food producing. And when there are pesticides available, they use a lot less of them. Whereas in Western countries, the amount of glyphosate, atrazine, these chemicals sprayed on food is enormously high. So I think that's a contributing factor as well. We know that these things are massively endocrine disrupting. And then we've got the pollution, the toxic air pollution going on. And then arguably, people also talk about things like EMF radiation, blue light. I'd also put that in there as well, because these things are adding extra stresses to the body, which maybe are not directly estrogenic, but they're still disrupting your natural circadian rhythm, your sleep wake cycles, potentially adding low grade stress to the body. And I think when you add all these things on top of each other, you create a very stressful and polluted environment for the human being to survive rather than thrive in. And I think that's what we're seeing in the younger generation.
So these pollutions, plastics and pesticides, uh, they're not similar to the estrogen molecule. Are they mimicking the effects of estrogen? What makes it a xenoestrogen?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I think sometimes in endocrinology, particularly in the 60s and 70s, They used to lump these synthetic estrogens and then bioidentical biological estrogen into the same category. Whereas
Right.
when we're looking at these estrogenic molecules, when they come into the body, they look like estrogen. So they bind with the estrogen receptor, but then they exert a different biological effect. But one of the problems is that when your body makes natural estrogen, it metabolizes into another estrogen called estrone, which the body is then able to eliminate and clear out via phase 2 liver detoxification. When the body takes in these xenoestrogenic molecules, it's very difficult for the body to get rid of it, especially for men who don't have the same detoxification pathways for estrogenic molecules as women do. So it comes into the body, it binds with the receptor, but it doesn't do the same thing as estrogen does. But it's also now not in balance with the androgens in the body, which is naturally what estrogen is made from. So it's throwing the body out of its natural balance, but then it's also exerting a different biological effect, and it's not metabolizing into the same downstream metabolites as natural estrogen, which also creates balancing and protective effects in the body as well. So it's coming in, binding with the same receptor, but exerting a far more powerful and arguably completely net negative effect as well.
I don't want to show my ignorance here, but do men produce estrogen endogenously?
Yes, we do. So men produce estrogen and women produce testosterone. We often think of testosterone as the male hormone and estrogen as the female hormone. I would actually argue that progesterone is more to women what testosterone is to men. It's the hormone that creates the masculine and feminine life force. And it's interesting how it interacts with the brain to facilitate this from a chemical level. So when we're looking at estrogen, women tend to make 5 to 10 times more endogenous estrogen as men do. Men make estrogen from testosterone. So when a man has testosterone, whether he makes it naturally or he injects it or applies it through TRT, it then goes through a process where it converts into two hormones. One is called dihydrotestosterone, which is a much stronger androgenic steroid, which is responsible for masculinizing traits. And it also metabolizes into estrogen, which has this balancing effect on dihydrotestosterone. So in a healthy man, this is all in balance. And having a small amount of estrogen in the body is very important for your heart, for your joints, for your brain, for virtually every system in the body. But what happens when a man is overweight, when his liver's not healthy, so he's drinking too much alcohol, he's got poor thyroid function, the amount of estrogen that he creates goes up. And then this creates an imbalance in the testosterone to estrogen equation, which I would argue is already skewed out of balance because of these external estrogens as well. And then men end up having this acquired androgen deficiency where there's not enough of the androgenic counterbalance to offset the action of these estrogenic molecules.
Thanks, Dave. That was a well thought out explanation. You mentioned before sunlight, and is there a correlation between the amount of sunlight you receive and the amount of testosterone you produce? And if there is that linked to vitamin D or are they unrelated?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the human, there are five fat soluble vitamins that we know of, which are vitamin A, E, D, K, and cholesterol. I would argue cholesterol is a vitamin. People can disagree on it. So when we look at getting nutrients from the sun, just like plants do and just like animals do, one of the many nutrients we get is vitamin D. And vitamin D is very important for signaling the entire sex hormone cascade. So when we either consume or manufacture internally cholesterol, we convert this into all the hormones in the body. DHEA, pregnenolone, progesterone, cortisol, testosterone, estrogen. There's this whole cascade that occurs. And vitamin D is very important for facilitating that entire cascade for flowing. And it's also responsible for making the receptor for testosterone more sensitive. Because when we've got these hormones floating around in the body, it's kind of like pinballs. So balls flying around on a pinball table. They don't do anything until they hit the bumpers, and then you get the points. Hormones are the same. They don't do anything until they activate a receptor. So when we look at vitamin D as well as sun exposure, that upregulates the receptors to the testosterone, as well as helping your body manufacture it more. So the argument is, well, why can't we just take vitamin D? And you can, and it does help, but it doesn't give you the full nutrient signaling that we get from the sun, all the different wavelengths. But also, what the sun is doing is it's signaling to your body what time of day it is and where you are in alignment with the rotation of the sun and the moon, which is called the circadian rhythm. So at night, when it gets dark, your body makes more melatonin, your cortisol goes down, you rest and relax. And then in the morning, as the sun rises, your cortisol comes up, your melatonin comes down, and you rise and get out of bed. And having that rhythm and these hormonal interactions over the 24-hour period is very important for the yin and yang push pull balances biologically in the body. So when people stay inside all day, they look at their screens all day, they don't get the different spectrums of sunlight at different times. The body has a lot of trouble syncing up with this clock. So we are lazy and lethargic during the day, and then at night we're all wired and stimulated because we're not getting that proper flow. And it's that proper flow that allows the body to produce hormones, antioxidants, anti-inflammatory molecules naturally. So a lot of what I talk about in my practice as a health coach is teaching guys who are often quite resistant to it the scientific importance of nature, because it's absolutely crucial that we are in alignment with our environment. And especially living in Australia, I'm quite intolerant to men having a vitamin D deficiency. Over here, 6 to 9 months that it's dark, it's going to get to -20 in winter. You can be low in vitamin D here. That's acceptable. But in Australia, so many guys would improve their health by just going outside a bit more.
Are you curious about how working with your shadow can improve your life and your relationships? Every Tuesday night at 6 p.m, I host a confidential live Q&A call where you can ask questions, access resources, and receive personal coaching from me. I have so many people come to me ready to do their shadow work, but they tell me they just can't afford the financial investment of one of my programs. So, to make professional shadow work accessible to as many of you as possible, I've created the Shadow Work Academy. The Academy is an online space where you get instant access to my inspired community of like-minded individuals doing the work and taking full responsibility for their lives. You'll have the opportunity to hear other members' stories and share your own. Within the community, you can post your questions, challenges, and breakthroughs, as well as seek professional support and guidance from me personally on the live weekly call. Within the Academy, you'll also find my men's sexual mastery course called the Sexual Samurai and my introductory level shadow work course, Shadow Boxing Level 1. Access to the Academy is 100% free until December 24. If you join before then, your access will be free for life. While we're on the subject of sunlight and vitamin D and its effects on testosterone, what are the natural ways? So apart from using testosterone replacement therapy, and I believe there's a number of natural ways that a man can increase his endogenous testosterone production. Can you give us an indication what some of those ways are and whether they're effective or whether they're myth?
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff at the moment that's marketed and sold online by, it's only supported and promoted by the people who sell it as natural testosterone boosters. If it comes in a capsule, it's not going to work. There's just not enough of anything in a capsule that's actually good for you that will improve your natural testosterone production. So the main thing that improves your natural testosterone production is the stuff that people don't want to do because it requires work. It's about, and I often say this, I've done a whole lecture on this. You have to start doing all the things you know you should be doing and stop doing all the things you know you shouldn't be doing. That will generally fix it. So the things that people need to be doing is more sunlight, more movement, more exercise. The things that people need to eliminate is the drugs, alcohol, and junk food. Those are the big three. And when we look at how all of this stuff works together, it's very difficult in the human body as a series of interconnected systems to go, oh, just take this or do more of this, and this entire equation will fix itself. We have to look at it very holistically. So, from a dietary standpoint, I know that vegan diets are quite popular, plant-based diets are quite popular, but objectively, scientifically, they lower free testosterone. We know this from research. And all the nutrients that the body requires to make testosterone are found in animal-based foods, particularly red meat and eggs are the richest in these nutrients. So increasing the intake of steak and eggs, the bodybuilders have known it for a long time. So that's an important one. And then reducing all the inflammatory junk in the diet, particularly the most harmful thing that people are consuming is deep fried food, because when they take those seed oils and they heat and cool and heat and cool and heat and cool in that deep fryer every day, they're oxidizing it multiple times. And when you put that into the body, and this has been found in literature very extensively, that consistently oxidized, repeated omega 6 fatty acids put the body into a very pro inflammatory state, which reduces sex hormone production. And that kind of leads to the final point, which is this: you want to be in a low inflammatory state to produce healthy testosterone levels. And the number one thing that people can do for this is getting rid of excess body fat. For men to have healthy hormone production, they need to be the opposite of diabetic. They need to be very insulin sensitive. And the way to be very insulin sensitive is to increase the amount of skeletal muscle mass and decrease the amount of body fat. So abs aren't just for the beach, they're for health. And under 15% body fat is going to allow for optimal hormone production. That's a lot leaner than a lot of people are. And then when it comes to removing things, alcohol is the biggest problem. And working now, I've just launched my second clinic in Europe. So working now, owning multiple clinics, dealing with people who aren't health enthusiasts, it can be quite difficult to explain and educate to people that you can't drink like a rock star and be healthy. I would also argue that you can't drink alcohol at all and be in good health. But I think a lot of people can get away with maybe 1 to 2 drinks once a week, maybe twice a week if they're in good health. But there's individual variance. But excess consumption of alcohol, anything more than 2 to 4 standard drinks a week, is absolutely ruining people's hormone production, because we have to have a very healthy liver. Tribes, communities, different cultures all over the world have all known the importance of the health of the liver. And when we drink alcohol consistently, we're constantly taking things like paracetamol, ibuprofen, these other pharmaceutical drugs that are quite harsh on the liver. It destroys a very important part of detoxification, which will then damage the hormonal system. So overall, it's kind of like if we're looking at servicing a car, we have to service every part of the car. We can't just upgrade the engine. So we have to put the body back into alignment with the way it's supposed to be to produce optimal signaling for reproduction, rather than taking it out of a survival state. So it's a bit more of a it's a bit more work than people often want to put in. But the problem is that if they don't do those things and they go on testosterone replacement therapy, this is what causes all the side effects. So you're going to have to do all those things anyway, because if you take your Suzuki Swift that needs a service down to the mechanic and he goes, Ferrari engine, we'll put that in here. That'll solve the problem. You'll speed out of the car park and then it will fall apart in 8 weeks. And this is the problem that we're having with a lot of men jumping on TRT. They're going, I don't want to do all that. I'll just go on TRT. And now you're putting a huge amount of testosterone, you're putting the healthy levels of a man into an unhealthy body. So you're creating this environment that would never be attainable naturally. And this disconnect between what you're putting in and how you're living is what creates the side effects that we see on treatment. So if you want to have healthy testosterone levels, you try to get them naturally. And if that doesn't work, you still have to do all that stuff as if you were making it.
Right, makes sense. Yeah, if you put a big engine in a car, you've also got to change the chassis, the brakes, the suspension, all the other equipment. You can't just put a bigger motor in, or you're going to crash. And that's what you're saying. If you go on testosterone, but you haven't got rid of the excess fat, you haven't got the lean muscle mass, you're not getting the sunlight, you're not doing these other things, you're going to get symptoms, side effects.
Absolutely. And that's where there can be some
Yeah.
nuance to it, because if a man is very far off track, it's also important to recognize that the further you are off track, the harder it is to get back on track. And sometimes using testosterone to help a man get back on track is very effective. But then we have to titrate and adjust the dose to make sure that as he's getting healthier, now we're putting the levels up to match that rather than shooting through the moon and then expecting him to just get with the program over time. So, yes.
Yeah, you mentioned so lean muscle mass and low fat. What's the relationship between fat, cholesterol, and testosterone? In other words, can you get into problems if you're having like a low fat diet, or you're taking something like a statin or Ozempic or something like this? Is that causing any problems in terms of testosterone production?
Yeah. So the cholesterol is probably one of the most contentious fields in preventative medicine. And the argument is that because your body makes its own cholesterol, then you don't need to consume any from diet. The reason why your body makes its own cholesterol is because if your cortisol goes to zero, you'll drop dead. And cortisol is made from cholesterol. So it's a survival mechanism. The amount of cholesterol that you need to thrive versus the amount that you need to survive is very different. And this is where there can be some arguments about, is fat important for producing testosterone? And it is. But eating a bunch of canola oil, soybean oil, peanut butter, all of these things, these aren't helping the testosterone production. It's not the fat as a macronutrient, it's fat as a vessel for the fat soluble micronutrients. So if you're consuming a low fat diet, let's say under 100 grams of fat a day, but all of that fat is coming from red meat and egg yolks, you'd probably be doing just fine for hormone production. So it's important that we're intaking these fat soluble nutrients. And the low fat diet that was all the rage, when I was growing up in the early 90s, that was one of the worst things for hormone production because we swapped nutritious, nutrient dense fat sources for processed sugar, which is just empty energy. So fat is very important for giving us these vitamins A, E, D, K, and cholesterol to give the body the building blocks to make these hormones in the first place. So I recommend that people, if they're trying to get leaner, but then also have the amount of nutrients they need to make these hormones, because it can sound like a paradox, is to be focusing on what's the most nutrient dense fat gram per gram. And that is egg yolks, number one. Discarding the egg yolk and keeping the white is crazy from a nutritional standpoint, as well as things like grass fed beef. The healthier the cow, the more nutritious the fat's going to be. And you can often see that in the fat. Sometimes, if it's a grass fed animal, it will have like a yellow, orangey tinge to the fat. That's the vitamin A, that's the retinol from the cow eating the grass and having a healthy diet. So having these nutritious fat sources, but not, excess amount of calories is important for getting leaner and allowing your body to produce the amount of testosterone that it needs. And that's why it's so important that we come in and go, okay, this diet is the foundational building block of health. So this is the first thing to get into alignment before looking at, hijacking the endocrine system with TRT. And then with things like Ozempic, I'm personally not a fan of any form of novel pharmaceutical. I think that there's two things that you don't want to be an early adopter of. I used to sell mobile phones. One is technology. They don't get it right the first time. Wait for them to bring out the second version of it. And two is pharmaceuticals. So if a pharmaceutical is still under patent in the first 8 to 9 years of its life cycle, there are no long-term follow-up studies on what this does long-term. If someone is morbidly obese and they're about to die from obesity induced disease, the risk of Ozempic is probably lower than the risk of not using it if they truly can't get back on track. Sure, 100%. But if someone's just a bit lazy and a bit, slack with food and has a bit of a sweet tooth, using something like Ozempic, semaglutide, tirzepatide, these GLP-1 injectable drugs, it's like cutting your grass with a chainsaw, and we don't know the long-term effects of this. And these medications are like orders of magnitude stronger versions of metformin. And we know from over 100 years of metformin use that it is clinically effective, but it does cause side effects. And if we're going to be taking something so powerful and so strong, you might be solving one problem, but creating two more. And I think when we're looking at pharmaceuticals, it should be guilty until proven innocent. And I think the emphasis of risk on the unknown should be very high.
Yeah, I believe I think Ozempic's made in the European Union but banned there, and that the major market is the US. I find that interesting.
Yeah, the European Union is a lot more protective over its pharmaceutical industry as well as its food supply. And I see a lot at the moment. There's a very emotional argument to proposing that people use Ozempic. It's not cheating. It's okay if you need this. And I think people are hugely kicking the can down the road, sorry, the risk of these potential side effects popping up long term. And I've had two guys who've used it who both developed Graves' disease. So they had to have their thyroid removed as a result. And these are two extreme examples, but I haven't had that many guys use it. I mean, it's something that in my client population is quite rare because I tend to be working with guys who are a bit healthier. But practitioners all over the world are seeing people come in with horrific side effects from these medications, and I think it's really important that if people are looking at needing to lose weight, using something like Ozempic is a very powerful cheat code. I think it's more important to learn to navigate diet, navigate hunger, navigate exercise, so that you can learn to not get into the same situation as you're in now in the future.
Yeah, people are usually looking for the easiest or the convenient solution. They want change, but they don't want to have to change. I mean, you're a coach. I'm a coach. You'll see this with some of your clients. They want all the benefits of change in their well. They want to change their life situation. They want to change their body. They want to change their mindset. But then when you ask them to change their habits of or their behaviors, they can be quite resistant. And this is what you're up against a lot of the time: is that people will reach for what they think is the quick or the convenient solution, but quite often, there are no shortcuts to a lot of these processes. And yeah, I'm the same as you. Like I'm not a big fan of pharmaceuticals. I mean, I've got a freezer in my house that's got a quarter of a cow in it, and I've got chickens in the yard that are producing, organic eggs. I'm more likely to use my food as my medicine rather than reach for a pharmaceutical. Just going back to the conversation we were having around natural ways for men to increase testosterone levels. I was listening to a Andrew Huberman podcast, and I think I remember correctly. He said that if a man is sexually aroused and he can maintain that state of sexual arousal, and the longer he maintains that state of sexual arousal, the more he will increase testosterone production. But the idea is to take it all the way, but not to ejaculate. And so he allows an extended period of sexual arousal, but without ejaculating. I think he mentioned something like you can get a 400% increase in testosterone. Now, if I got that right, is he referring to just an immediate increase or a sustained increase, or is it a myth?
I haven't heard this in this context, but I believe this to be true. I believe that this same mechanism is why so many younger men become addicted to porn, because they are using this to self medicate their low testosterone to give them that boost. There are some really interesting studies. I often joke that I would have loved to have been involved in these studies because some studies just sound fantastic, where they basically took a bunch of men and then they took a bunch of women that they were attracted to and they measured all their different neurotransmitter levels, hormone levels when they were in the same room with them, when they were rubbing up against their bodies. They measured the physiological response of men to a woman that they found attractive. And they found that being in the presence of women who they found attractive and being in a low grade arousal state produced massive endorphin effects. So, increase in testosterone, increase in serotonin, increase of dopamine, reduction in inflammation, all the things that we would typically look for from an antidepressant response, men get when they are aroused. So I think that this is also one of the things that again drives men, younger men who have low testosterone, who are more avoidant, so they're more risk adverse. They have a lower biological buffer to stress, and I think this is what leads them to seeking out pornography rather than interactions with real women because they're able to humans are very good at self-medicating things for better or for worse. So I think in these situations, this is why they're seeking out this arousal because it's making them feel better and it's self-medicating their low testosterone state. When it comes to what Andrew Human was talking about there, I'm not familiar with the study, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a short-term acute thing because the
Yeah.
testosterone and hormone interactions are very up and down. But when you get a spike of testosterone, it works at the receptor for longer than it peaks. So it would create a sustained effect, mood wise, biologically wise, but it would be like a bit of a roller coaster. Yeah.
Yeah, another thing he mentioned about testosterone, which I found really interesting, this is Huberman again, is that he said that testosterone is the hormone that makes effort pleasurable.
Mhm.
Do you know, have you heard of this concept?
Yeah, so this is what a lot of my third book is about. I've got a three-part lecture series if people want to check this out on YouTube. It's called Your Brain on Testosterone and the War on Masculinity. And this is one of the most interesting things from a neuropsychiatric and behavioral psychology angle when we're looking at testosterone. So the body produces the two stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, and they feel subjectively quite similar. And the body is supposed to produce these under stress so that you can produce a fight or flight response. Very useful hormones for being in a emergency situation. So what happens when a man is in a higher testosterone state is that testosterone and its metabolite dihydrotestosterone have an antagonistic effect, a buffering effect on the stress hormones physiologically in the body. And this is very important for the body to be able to produce dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter that allows us to feel pleasure, reward. It creates motivation. It's what we tend to be seeking. So if a man with high testosterone is in a scenario, let's say he wants to approach a pretty girl, maybe he wants to go rock climbing, he wants to go big wave surfing, wants to open a business, something with some risk and reward, that equation of, yeah, this is stressful, this is scary, but it feels good, it's making me feel alive, this is giving me a rush, that's going to be facilitated by the testosterone overshadowing the stress hormone response to allow for proper dopamine production. If we take that same scenario and we get rid of the testosterone, that cortisol and adrenaline level is going to be at the same in the blood, but there's going to be less internal buffering towards the effects of that. So now, when a guy is in a situation with all these ideas, there's not enough dopamine being created in the brain. So he's much more likely to go, oh, that's not worth the risk. No, 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 and become avoidant. And what this leads to, I mean, we see it in younger guys. We're not seeing these guys in their early 20s be risk takers, go and want to take on the world, leave their mark on the world, go and do these big, great things. They're going, well, I want the girls and I want the simulation of war and violence and I want the rush, but I don't want the risk. So they go for video games, pornography, gambling, drugs,
Mm.
because that's easier for them to get that hit of dopamine, but from the comfort of their own home. And my angle on this is what happens when this behavior occurs during a man's formative years, and where is he going to end up and who is he going to become at 30, 35, 40, when you're supposed to have achieved mastery of self, mastery of your career, mastery of your skills. And personally, I can really identify with this because I think I fell into that category before my use of testosterone and my brain injury because I saw what was happening there. My band, when I was in my early 20s, we'd be touring around the east coast of Australia and I'd just be anxious for no reason. I mean, I was the singer of the headlining band. I should have been confident and having the best time. And I was just always anxious about nothing. So I would, spend my time in the hotel room or in the tour van because I didn't want this risk of just nothing. I didn't want to go outside my comfort zone because it didn't feel good. And I see that a lot in the guys who are coming through who are in their early 30s, late 30s. They don't have a lot to show for themselves. They're anxious about everything. They've got this learned fear, this social anxiety, but they can't justify why it is. They don't know where it's coming from. And then they feel this enormous sense of guilt and shame because they know that they could be better, but they just can't get that follow through. And it's like they've been, in a Formula One race the entire time with a Suzuki Swift, and they didn't realize that's what they were driving.
So testosterone does make effort feel more pleasurable. Does it also increase your likelihood to take risk? I think that's what I heard you saying. And so if you look at teenage boys, they're the biggest risk takers I know. When I was between 15 and 20, I took all sorts of risks that I wouldn't take now. And that's when my testosterone levels were probably through the roof. So, with a healthy testosterone level, you're more likely to take risk. How does that explain how some of the younger men today, like you say, aren't taking real risks with women, or they're watching porn, or rather than joining the defense forces, they're playing Call of Duty on online. So men are like younger men are taking less risks, but at an age where their testosterone should be quite high. I'm just not sure of how to understand that.
Yeah. So instead of taking risks, they're all taking antidepressants because they've got depression and anxiety. I think when we look at what effort is risk. Effort is going outside the comfort zone and pushing to say, is pushing in this capacity, giving this time, energy, effort, all of these factors, is that going to give me a return on my investment? Getting outside my comfort zone or pushing harder and having more biological and psychological resilience. And when we look at risk taking, I think it's important to take risks, but also have a pretty decent IQ and EQ, or you could take the wrong risks and end up doing danger to yourself and others. And that's, this, young, dumb, high testosterone archetype, that's not particularly positive either. So I think it has the capacity to go either way. And that's why I think self development is such an important and crucial thing for men to do, regardless of their age. But yeah, that's exactly what I'm noticing, and what I see happening is that younger guys, when they're supposed to be at that peak risk taking age where they want to go and challenge themselves, they want to go and have that rite of passage. They want to go, that looks hard. That, like, I remember when my testosterone levels peaked, and they peaked probably low when everyone else was high. I remember standing on the beach in Perth. For those who don't know Perth, we don't get any surf in Perth because Rottnest Island blocks all the waves. So the only time we could get a good surf was in a storm. Right before the storm hit, you could get a good storm swell. And I remember standing with my surfboard with my three higher testosterone friends at about 15 years old, and just looking out at this insane just waves and churning. And they were all so excited to go and take it on. And I was pissing myself. And I think that kind of attitude, and I probably smarter than them because it was dangerous. But I think that attitude, when you can extrapolate that out into all these different circumstances, I think the consequence of not taking the risks when they should be taken, and not pushing outside the comfort zone, and not, developing this resilience. And I might be butchering this. You know more about this, but I believe Carl Jung refers to the term neurosis, where you become more hypersensitive to the perceived emotional stresses, so then you become avoidant. I call it snowflake syndrome. And I think this is one of the adaptive challenges of humans, is that if you're not getting more resilient, you're getting softer. We're quite plastic in that regard. And I think this is one of the problems with character development, is that guys are coming up and they're not going through the rites of passage and the challenges they need to, and then they're not equipped to deal with the challenges and the risks that they must take when they're older.
Yeah, I posted something recently. Soft men need to harden, and hard women need to soften. And
Mm.
it's I think there's a whole polarity shift going on there. And we'll get to that in a moment, because your book talks about the war on masculinity, and I want to talk about that in a moment. But I just wanted to talk about something else. So I was watching again another Huberman podcast with Jack Cruz. I'm I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he has this concept that if the body makes it, don't take it. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with NAD, but I've been taking NAD for about the last 2 years, and my body makes NAD. But I know that age and inflammation reduce your NAD levels. So uh, if me taking NAD intravenously, is that going to do you know is that going to reduce my natural production of NAD, or do you know anything about this at all?
Yeah. So with and I think that I would disagree with that statement of, if your body makes it, don't take it, as a whole. I think it is suitable in some circumstances, but I would also argue that taking things that are bioidentical that endogenously occur would be much more healthful and safer than taking things that are synthetic and don't endogenously occur. The body has a very good way of maintaining homeostasis. And it does this via what are called negative feedback loops. So, for example, when you take testosterone, your body then senses that, oh, there's a whole bunch of testosterone here. The receptors all become activated. So then internal production goes down. And this is so the body can maintain this balance, kind of like a thermostat. So if there's too much, production will reduce. If there's too little, production will go up, assuming that you're healthy. So when the body goes, oh, well, it's all here, we don't need to do anything, then that natural production goes to zero. So the signal from the pituitary in the brain down to the testicles goes to zero. They don't need to do any work. So this is a problem for natural production. But if we're in a situation where that natural production no longer works and is creating a disease state, the idea of not correcting that and not optimizing that has more deleterious outcomes, because the only deleterious outcome of this replacement is you're now dependent on it. So I use the analogy, and the same would apply to NAD, is that as we know in a lot of things, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So let's say your body is a box factory, it's like a production line of boxes, and if you fire someone, you're going to have to come in and do that job in their place. But now you get to do their job at the highest possible capacity. And if you look at the trade-off between that, I inject myself with testosterone twice a week, but I get to have the healthiest possible physiological levels of testosterone throughout my 20s and into the rest of my life. Good trade. So if there's a negative feedback loop and we're disrupting that, that's not ideal. But if the trade-off is worthwhile, then I think not doing so is kind of silly. But when we're looking at other things in the body, and this is something that, I don't want to be disrespectful to anyone, but this is something that Andrew Huberman gets drastically wrong. Is melatonin, for example, is something that he talks about not to take, because up until about 2010, 2011, we thought that there was this negative feedback loop where if you took melatonin, then your body wouldn't make melatonin. This is your natural sleep hormone. So there was a very good study that came out in about 2011, 2012 that showed that that feedback doesn't exist. There's no suppression of natural production of melatonin. And if people want to check that, if you search examine melatonin on Google, there's a very good summary of that review showing that this is wrong. So not everything in the body is subject to this negative feedback loop and regulation. When it comes to NAD, I think that research is still in its infancy to show conclusively that there's not a negative feedback, but it doesn't look like there is at this stage. But again, the argument is, well, as you get older and those levels are coming down, if you are restoring those levels back to a healthful, youthful level, as long as it's still biologically appropriate, the risk that they would talk about is going, oh, well, if you stop taking it, now your production's going to go to zero. But we know from things like glutathione, which is another great antioxidant that we make and we take exogenously, if you take a bolus dose of that weekly, monthly, every couple of months via an IV injection, your natural production is not impacted. So I think there are some things with a feedback loop, but many things don't have that feedback loop. So yeah, I would disagree with that.
Yeah, I like your explanation there, and I can see where Jack Cruise's statement, if your body makes it, don't take it, as an absolute concept, it does fall over, because if you're your body makes insulin, but if it stops making it, you need to start taking it, and so I think he's that holds up in a healthy person, but if you're deficient, then you need to be taking it. And as I was saying, I know my NAD levels have dropped because of my age and inflammatory process, and some of that inflammatory process is my ankylosing spondylitis, but a lot of it's diet. So I'm pretty much on an anti-inflammatory diet now, and so I'm supplementing with NAD, and it makes the biggest difference. So yeah, I'm not going to stop. And your NAD can't go to zero, because if it did, you'd drop dead, because it's what your mitochondria uses to produce energy in every cell. So I find NAD is the one supplement that I take regularly and really feel the benefits of. I was just wondering whether there was any negative um, outcome with taking NAD, but I can't think of one. One of the amazing side effects of NAD is that it blocks cravings. And I didn't know that. I started taking it for increased energy. And I started to notice I don't drink alcohol anymore. I just lost the craving for it. I don't crave caffeine or sugar like I used to. I'll still have an occasional coffee because I enjoy it. I'll still eat an occasional sweet thing. But the NAD really blocks cravings. And I know they use it in drug and alcohol rehab for that reason. So yeah, for me, there's no downside to taking NAD. Thanks for clearing that up. I thought we just switch now to the topic of the war on masculinity. So we'll get off maybe hormones, although they're related. What do you when you in your book mentions the war on masculinity, and it's a bit of a trending topic at the moment. Even I did a recent podcast with a psychologist, local psychologist in the area, and we talked about the phrase toxic masculinity. And I think that's just a disgusting phrase. I don't know who came up with it. I mean, if it's masculinity, it's not toxic. You can have toxic behavior, and you can see that in men and women, but just creating terms like toxic masculinity, no good can come from that. And so I don't like that kind of phraseology. But I do think there's a war on a lot of things at the moment. And one of those is the family. And, uh, and part of that is through the war on masculinity. And I would just like to hear a little bit what's your take on the war on masculinity, and what are some of the things that you talk about in your book that's coming out?
Yeah, I completely agree that there's a war on a lot of things. I think there's also a war on femininity. I think there's a war on the family. And yes, I completely agree. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity. Just because men can be dickheads, it doesn't mean that it's a masculine thing that's toxic. It's just it's a ridiculous term. So I think that part of this, I think the whole angle here is that strong men are difficult to control. Revolutions are started by strong men. And I think when we look at, well, what is masculinity? Masculinity to me is the capacity to have leadership and to be a leader. That to me is what masculinity is. Men are leaders, and the capacity of a leader in terms of stress resilience, being virtuous, being driven, being able to accept responsibility and accountability for a group and to drive things forward. To me, that is masculinity. And I think the more of that there is in society, the more difficult it is to condition and control society. And I think it's very interesting that when we look at what's going on, a lot of what's going on in the West, there seems to be a very clear agenda and social conditioning towards fostering and even worshiping weakness and pedestalizing, low grade mental health disorders. And I think that this is a very interesting thing that we're looking at now. And I think the ultimate goal is to basically create a society of subservient tax slaves, basically, people who will just follow the rules, be strong enough to pay their tax, but not weak enough to stand up and say enough is enough. And I think that that's a very conscious and deliberate thing that's going on. And I think that it's coming in through the diet, it's coming in through Hollywood, it's coming in through cultural conditioning. And I think that that's the ultimate goal, is to make people easier to control and less likely to push back and be oppositional, to have people be more agreeable. And I think that another way that they've done this is that they've encouraged women to be hard. Like, I don't think soft men are feminine and hard women are masculine. I think that's a term I don't like. But I think part of what's aiding and supporting this is that they're encouraging women to do the role of the masculine, and they're encouraging men and women not to need each other anymore and to go, men don't need women and women don't need men. We absolutely both need each other. And a very good example of this, and one of the reasons why I love living here, is that if you make it minus 20 and dark for 6 months, men and women start needing each other a whole lot more. Because it is brutal and it is rough to go to work and get up in the cold and push through winter. You need that feminine, nurturing energy when you come home. And it's also the man's role to get out and scrape the ice off the car. And when the cars get bogged in the ice, someone's got to come around and push it. Like as conditions get harsher and as the environment gets more real, or economically as we move closer to the poverty line, men and women start needing each other a whole lot more. So I think part of what the goal is to say men and women can be independent. We don't need each other. The nuclear family is bad. Let's have everyone be independent. And that makes everyone easier to condition and control, because now it's not the father and the family that's instilling the values. It's the government, it's the conditioning, it's the media, it's Hollywood. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now, particularly in the West. And that's one of the things I like about over here is that cultures like this, which have much stronger, firmer family units, are a lot more resistant to this conditioning that's really taken hold in Australia lately.
Hey, men, isn't it time you took your lovemaking to mastery level? Are you ready to impress your intimate partner and leave her fully satisfied yet wanting more? My Sexual Samurai program is designed to put you back in control of your sexual energy. Imagine being able to generate your full sexual potential, sustain it, and then direct it at will. In just a few weeks of disciplined practice, you'll master voluntary control over your sexual orgasm. You'll also learn how to integrate the hidden aspects of your sexual shadow, empowering you to step into your full masculine archetype. Whether your problem is performance anxiety, premature ejaculation, or low libido, or you're just wanting to step into your full masculine, my Sexual Samurai program is for you. Head to the Shadow Work Academy via my website or check out the show notes for more information. Yeah, good point. I really like your explanation there around if you emasculate the male population, you're making the population more compliant, and therefore any government agendas or globalist agendas are going to get less resistance. I saw a documentary a while back, a few months back, on New Zealand and the way they're building more and more prisons and how they're incarcerating a lot of the Maori men. And if you want to see an example of a masculine warrior, it's a Maori man. And this documentary was really compelling because they're building these like supermax prisons, and they went inside and filmed it. And these yards are just, it looked like an army. These guys were just tooling up in the gym, stacking on the lean muscle mass, and all with big smiles on their face. And it seems to me like New Zealand and Australia to some extent are testing grounds for compliancy, and how much government overreach can we get in terms of making populations compliant. And in Australia and New Zealand, I think we're particularly compliant in the way that we don't push back hard enough against things like, laws against freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and these kind of things. And so I do take your point that the war on masculinity is designed to make people more compliant, less resistant, less likely to revolt against kind of globalist, centralized forms of control and coercion of populations.
Australia is an amazing place to live. It's a beautiful, phenomenal country, and I think that's what's bred the compliance. Is it's like and particularly growing up in Perth, it was like growing up in a bubble, in a bubble, in a bubble, in a bubble. And I think when you have it so good for so long, culturally, people just take these things for granted. And then I think when it comes along with a threat, let's say the pandemic or whatever that was that happened in 2020, I think people are much more likely to go, "Oh, I don't want to lose this. We've got this good. Keep me safe. Let's hold on to this." And I think that's one of the issues as well, is that in Western countries, people have had it so good for so long that they have forgotten the importance and the need for standing up against what the consequence is if we don't have those strong male archetypes to protect us from the greater threats and the greater evil. And I think that as the months and years go on, people are going to become more and more aware, if they're not already, of how systemically and horrifically corrupt Australian leadership is. It's like this cancer is growing through, and it has been going through Australian politics for a long time. And I think more and more people are starting to become aware of that. But it's a shame that as more people are waking up to it, they're just compliant, going, oh, that's normal. Political corruption's normal. All this stuff's normal. And it's kind of like it's turning that frog up slowly. If you turn the heat up too quickly, he'll jump out. But if you turn it up slowly, he'll stay in and boil. And I think that Australia, from the outside looking in now, I've been living abroad for almost 4 years. It's very clear that that's what's going on. And I think people are still sticking their heads in the sand, thinking that if they do, it'll go away and it will all blow over. And I think if the current economical and housing crisis is showing people anything, like this is the tip of the iceberg, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this piece of legislation that just got passed in New Zealand recently. I think it's called the Pandemic Plan 2025, maybe, or 2024. And I had a look at this online, and there was some clauses in this bill that say that in future pandemics, that a medical officer, so that don't define what a medical officer is, but that a medical officer can perform any medical procedure on anybody they deem fit that needs that medical procedure. And not only that, but that the police can be involved in that process, and that the police can use the amount of force necessary for compliance of that. So
Scary.
I've never seen anything like that before in legislation. But what it sounds like to me is some sort of forced medical procedure. And why would they write a law, a, a law into? Why would they pass a law like that unless they were planning to do such things? And for me as a man, you said that what is masculinity? Masculinity for you is a leader, someone who takes responsibility, accountability. For me, it's also somebody who provides safety, protection, and security for women and children. And so, I've just recently had my daughter. She's 8 weeks old,
Congratulations.
and yeah, thanks. And that's really captivated something in me. It's brought out this kind of fierce protector in me. And we don't have that same law in Australia, at least not yet. But if there was a pandemic and some medical officer showed up with a police officer at my home and wanted to enforce some medical procedure on me, my partner, or my child, then they're going to see an aspect of my masculinity that I've probably never demonstrated before, because I'm going to rise up to the occasion and find that part of me that will fiercely defend against that kind of tyranny. And so I've come to this position in several ways. Like my passion is shadow work. I think you know that about me. In fact, I think you've sent some of your clients to me. So through my process of exploring my shadow, I got to see the darkness in me, and I got to see my inner beast and my inner monster. And Jordan Peterson talks about this, that you really want to train your monster, because we've all got a monster in us. But I used to be quite a pacifist and like like one of these soy boys. Like I had no propensity for violence, even if it was to protect my loved ones. And I think I was quite naive. And then through doing a shadow work process, I got to uncover that inside me is a beast. And if called upon, that beast, which is part of my masculinity, would fight tyranny, would stand up against tyrannical forces. And so I'm a believer in freedom of speech, freedom of movement, bodily autonomy. I don't think any man or institution has the right to dictate what I say, where I move, and what I put in my body or not. So there's a push, a legislative push through governments and institutions to see how far the population will be compliant. And I think a lot of the response to the COVID pandemic was really a test of compliancy. And I think we failed that test here in Australia. I think we were way too compliant, and that's showing up now. And a lot of people agree with that. A lot of the measures they put in place didn't work. It was known that they didn't work. They didn't make a difference, but yet everybody complied with those. And so I take your point that in Australia we've had things too good for too long. We've become too complacent, too compliant, and there's not much resistance in the population here. And I think the men in Australia, Australian men, need to wake up and need to embrace their masculinity and need to see themselves as fierce protectors and providers of safety and security for women and children. And there's not enough of this conversation going on. In fact, there's the opposite. I don't know if you've been following the Australian situation, Dave. The current government, I think, has put aside $1 billion to fight what they call um, gender-based violence. This is domestic violence, but specifically man against woman. And I think I talked about this in another podcast. I think gender-based violence is another one of these made-up phrases to paint a certain picture. It's not gender-based violence. Violence is just violence. It's not gender-based. If a man hits his partner, he's not hitting her because she's a woman. You know, if a woman hits her husband, which happens a lot of the time, she's not hitting him because he's a man. So it's not gender based. And the other thing, I don't know if you're aware of this, Dave, is that in Victoria they've taken the step of appointing a parliamentary secretary for men's behaviour change. So not people's behaviour change, not men and women's behaviour change, but men need to change, and the government think that they know how to change men to make this problem of gender-based violence go away. It's so it's so nonsensical, and it is part of this war on masculinity to try and portray men as monsters. Now, we all have a monster in us, including women. And I've got plenty of male clients of mine who are being subject to the monster in their female ex partner. Women can be monsters too. If men need to change, women need to change. But there's a real, it's skewed towards men are the problem. And so first of all, how does that occur to you living in the European Union? I'm sure it wouldn't fly over there that they would have a minister for behaviour for men's behaviour change. What do you think of that?
One thing that's very interesting for me from the outside looking in Australia, because it's difficult to see the forest from the trees. Countries like this laugh at Australia and the UK. Like this stuff is just, it's like it's comedy. It's so absurd that it's just like it doesn't seem real. When I brought my wife over, she'd never been to Australia, and it was like it was just perplexing. You know, you'd walk into a supermarket and it would have a pride flag saying, you know, all genders and sexualities are welcome here, and it was like, what? So the places that don't have the sticker, they're not welcome. Like it was just so odd that this had just become part of this culture. And over here, people have real problems. Like if you wake up and it's just dumped a whole bunch of snow and like your car's bogged and you got to pay to keep the heating on, like all of these issues are just coming up as a result of people not having any real problems, and they're just making more problems and drama. And I think people buying into this is just a I think people have been conditioned from a young age, you know, with Hollywood and with fictional narratives that, you know, we consume for entertainment, that there always has to be some drama. And I think people feed into that too much. Over here, I had a similar thing, you know, when you said that, you know, your daughter was born and it kind of awoke that primal, you know, protect and provide part of who you were. I think that's really important because when we look at the stress response, the full version is fight, flight, or freeze. And if you're going to pick one of those in a stress situation, it should be fight. That's the thing that you should be leaning towards. And I think a lot of men think in those situations they would fight, but in reality, they would flight or they would freeze. And I think that that's where the testosterone and masculinity side of things comes in. That's very important. But I was over here the day that Russia hit Ukraine. And that was a very real thing that happened here. One, COVID went away that day. All of a sudden, it didn't exist anymore. There was no masks, no testing, nothing. It just vanished out of thin air. It's very interesting. Um, we find it crazy that people are still even talking about it in other countries, let alone still getting boosters. It's mental. Um, but when that happened, that awoke this. I had a very instant response, which was if something happens, I need to be able to fly my wife and her family out into a safe place and be able to provide for them if something happens. And looking back, I had never worked a day in my life up until that point, because that was when I started actually working hard. And that was when I
Right.
went full blown provider mode, because now I had a purpose and a reason to actually, build and accumulate resources. And, it was a horrible thing that happened, and it's still horrible, but it was the catalyst that turned my career into, something very meaningful, because now I had that drive. And the interesting thing that I found over here was that people didn't turn on each other. So we had much harsher regulations here. So you have, like, I didn't get vaccinated. I was living in a small apartment in Vilnius in the winter. I couldn't even go and get a takeaway coffee. I wasn't allowed in any shops, not even a little corner deli, nothing. So couldn't go anywhere or do anything. But over here, I remember when my wife got COVID, and I wanted to go to the pharmacy to get some supplements and some natural stuff to help her. And I got to the door, and they said, show your vaccine certificate. And I said, I don't have one. My wife's sick. Let me in. The guy took one look at me and said, go for it. Like, that's the kind of thing that we had over here. Like, people weren't going to get in the way of someone's family, especially get in the way of a guy who was a good 20 kilos heavier than him, because it was just common sense. Whereas in Australia, I saw that all these people were given power who had never had power and never earned power, and they instantly abused it. Anyone who got the chance to discriminate and enforce any kind of nonsensical belief system that they didn't even truly understand themselves, they abused it the moment they got the opportunity. And I found that to be very deplorable. I found it to be very disturbing. And that was one of the reasons I haven't come back to live in Australia, is seeing how Australians responded versus how Europeans responded. And I've got a client and a friend who's in Bulgaria, and Bulgaria is a pretty fierce place. And there was a point where they had to back down what they were doing with the COVID regulations, and they just had to back it off. And I was like, what happened? And he was like, we were going to burn it down. And I was like, what do you mean? And it's like, there was just so much resistance building up that they had to back off, or we were just going to burn the whole city to the ground. That fire and that mentality was tested for, like you said, in Australia, and it's not there. It doesn't matter what they do, it doesn't matter how far they go, there is not going to be that level of pushback like we have the capacity for over here. And that's the only thing, because again, over here, people remember the Soviet Union. We only got independence in 91. We remember what it was like. Well, not we, I wasn't here, but as a country, we remember what it was like. We remember how bad it was, and we remember the importance of freedom. Over here, you see people celebrating the fact that it's a warm, sunny summer day and they can go for a walk with their family. When you cherish and enjoy that and you have gratitude for that, you will also have a lot more resistance when someone comes along and tries to take it away. And I think that it's important that as a society, that value is there, which is that if it crosses a line, people will go, nope. And when the majority of the fighting age men were old enough to be alive during that period of time, I think that creates a very different cultural mentality, which I think is very important.
Yeah, I love that you've mentioned that twice. That there in Lithuania, you remember the Soviet Union. It wasn't that long ago. And on my earlier podcast I recorded this morning, I was talking to a local guy here about what happened in Russia under Stalin. And I think this should be compulsory reading. You should learn about this in primary school, because if you don't learn your history, we're likely to repeat it. And as you say, the people there know what happened under Stalin, and that's why here because we don't know what happened under these totalitarian regimes, the tens of millions of people that were murdered, uh, we we don't recognize these micro aggressions on our freedoms. Like the censoring of freedom of speech is where it starts, and so we've become very complacent because of that, and we don't see the connection between the small steps that go towards totalitarian regimes, and those are things like equity of outcome, taking away freedom, censoring freedom of speech, jailing political opponents, these kind of things that we're starting to see in places like Australia, the US. And it's only a few steps more, and you're in a situation where you've got big government controlling the people, and you're only a couple of steps away from totalitarianism. And so this is why I think there's more pushback in Lithuania, because it's not that long ago, that you have to go back to those times. And I think most people in Australia are completely clueless about what happened in Russia from 1914 to 1954. And if they did know, they'd be a lot more resistant to big government and control.
I think one thing that's very interesting that I see a lot in the West is that people now think capitalism is the cause of all their problems. Um, Capitalism is not perfect. Capitalism has got flaws, but if people open a history book, they'll see what came before capitalism and what capitalism is the alternative to. And it's like people have this mentality at the moment, which again, it's one of the reasons I don't live in the country is that, oh, the current system sucks, so let's destroy it, and whatever comes along will be better. It's like if you look throughout history, that has never worked out. And if you look at the system that we're operating under now, the corruption is there and it's problematic, but it's not the capitalism business model that's causing the issues. It's a whole bunch of these other malevolent problems which are arising. And this whole idea of, oh, yeah, this sucks, let's get rid of this, and whatever they replace it with is better. It's like you're really trusting that they have your best interest at heart. And giving a central governing body more power has never, ever, ever been a positive thing ever in the history of the world.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen with this war on masculinity, it's only going to make men stronger. I already see that things are slowly turning around. People are starting to wake up. And, I go to the gym and there's a lot of young guys in there putting on a lot of muscle mass. And it never used to, and there's gyms everywhere. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, these guys look like they're preparing for war. And, Australia's not technically at war with anybody, but I think it's a war against oppression. And I think people are feeling that. And I think men are naturally, biologically, spiritually inclined that when things start getting tough and things don't feel right, well, let's get in the gym and prepare for a fight. That's certainly how I'm feeling. I'm G'd up. I'm as fit as I've been. I'm in the gym 5 days a week. Like I said, I know I've got an inner beast in me, and I'm pleased with that beast. It's on a long lead, and I think more men need to wake up and see themselves, like you said, as leaders, and to take charge and to forget about what you're being told a man is. Just listen to your own internal resources and instincts, and I see that happening.
Yep.
What do you see happening in the current war on masculinity? I'm curious how you see it, and what do you see as the solution or solutions?
I think a lot more people suffer from the bystander effect than they would like to think. And for those who are listening, being like, "What's that?" It's like if you saw a car accident happen in front of you, you like to think that you'd run over and call 000 and do this, but in reality, most people just freeze. And it's a very well documented phenomenon. I think that's what happened last time. I think that if you interviewed people in 2018 or early 2019 and said, "Hey," if they came in and said, "You can't do this and you can't do that unless you get injected with this," what would you do? And I think a lot of people like to think they would have told them where to stick it, but they didn't when push came to shove because it was all happening and the people didn't know what was going on. And that makes sense to me. I'd like to think that if they try to pull it again, it's not going to work. Um,
Yeah,
but you know, I was also very surprised and disappointed. I was very surprised in WA when they brought it in for the FIFO guys. So for the fly in, fly out miners. I thought when they tried to mandate it for those guys, I thought that's when they were going to get together and go, no, because they're the more masculine guys. But when I spoke to them and I'm like, why did you all crumble? It's because they were all out there providing for their families. So they were already suffering. They already make sacrifice for their families. They were happy to make another one. But I think now that it's so obvious that the whole thing was BS and that the vaccine was poison and I think all of this stuff is now accepted fact. And I understand why people don't want to look at it because it scares them, just like the original thing scared them. But I think if they tried to do it again, I'd like to have faith in the population that we learned from the last experience to go, no, I'm not doing this again, and that enough people would come together and stand up against it. I really like to think that, and maybe it's just being a bit too optimistic, but that's what I'd like to think.
sorry to pause you there just a moment because I just want to get this point across. You mentioned about in Australia, and I certainly see it this way, that it's like we've got our head in the sand, and and people don't want to look at certain things. And I used to think that the people that weren't skeptical and didn't want to look more deeply into things and that just were compliant, I used to see them as weak, or I would have a negative judgment against them. That these people just need to wake up and think for themselves and look deeper into things rather than just go on the superficial layer of things and comply. And then I thought to myself recently, oh no, I get it now. I get why they don't want to look.
Yeah.
Because I think what we're up against is, globally, some sort of spiritual war of good against evil. And that there seems to be, in all this woke stuff, all this transgender stuff, all this globalist uh, business pandemics, there seems to be a lot of crazy ideas out there, and a lot of them seem tilted more towards evil than towards good. And so a lot of people turn away because to turn and face it, you're actually staring in the face of pure evil. And I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And I think the people who survived Stalinist Russia have a very good idea what the face of evil looks like. And so I understand why people don't want to think that the whole pandemic was manufactured, that the response was overreach, that these were harms caused upon them, because to consider that and face that would be have to confront evil. And a lot of people maybe don't have the stomach for that or the appetite for that. um, for some reason, I do. I don't mind staring evil in the face. I don't mind looking at it. I'd rather confront it. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And so that's why I have a kind of inquiring mind and like to look behind all these things to see what's really driving them. And so, yeah, I understand now why people stick their head in the sand, but I don't think it's a good long term solution. And I think part of the solution to the war on masculinity, at least for men, is to take their head out of the sand and look around.
I think if you realize one thing is an agenda and fictitious, then you have to also realize that a whole bunch of other stuff is as well. You can't just wake up to one thing. There's a process, and I think that that can be for people who've been oblivious to all of this their whole lives. I think that can be a big pill to swallow. It's kind of like the whole red pill, blue pill thing with the Matrix. I think the later you take the blue pill, sorry, the red pill, it's a suppository, and the bigger it gets. That's how I've been describing it for a while. And I think that the longer you've gone on thinking all this stuff, it can be a very uncomfortable wake up call. But there also has to be a lot of humility in that. A lot of people aren't good at admitting they're wrong. And then it's also realizing that the thing you took to keep you safe might actually be the thing that you should be afraid of. And the whole agenda that's keeping you safe is what you should be afraid of. So if you were already driven by fear, you don't want to create more fear and look at that. I understand all that stuff. And I have a lot of compassion for people who are like, I want to stay in my bubble. I've got X amount of years left. I don't want my bubble to burst. And I'm like, I don't want it to burst either. And I think that's really nice that some people have that. But I also think that reality is going to start to catch up with people. And there's this whole thing where people go like, if you're watching a James Bond movie, it's like, well, why is the bad guy just revealing his whole evil plan? Like, surely that's not a good move. you know, People can read Klaus Schwab's three-part book trilogy on exactly what he's planning to do with the world as running the World Economic Forum and what the COVID pandemic was. It's all written in his books. It's all there. It's all been very openly revealed. And I almost think that it's a mockery that they're just saying people are too dumb to realize this. And looking the evil in the face, I think, is very real. And I had a conversation with a friend a while back, and you know, Satan doesn't have to be real for people to die in a satanic sacrifice. The Aztecs were sacrificing people for many, many years to make sure the sun came up. The sun was still going to come up, but those people still died. And I think that that's the thing that is very scary, is that we don't really know what's going on with these evil agendas. But if we look throughout history, there's been a lot of very evil, very dark things that have happened for a very long time. And the idea that now we're in this blissful, peaceful utopia, it's like that actually doesn't follow the trend of history very well. So I think we're currently the event that we're in at the moment, we're going to be looking back on as a very significant, geopolitical event. And I think that again, when this comes around and coming back to this war on masculinity, that's that's the thing that people need to awaken to. And I think it's exactly what you're saying. People are waking up to this and going, oh, something is coming, something doesn't feel right. If they do this again, I want to be more prepared. And I think the way that you can be more prepared, coming back to this, what is masculinity, is developing this capacity for leadership, developing the capacity to maintain a sovereign mind, to be able to protect and provide for the people that you care about, to be able to take accountability and responsibility and create direction for the people around you and yourself. I think that's really important. And I think for the people who made a mistake with the last one that they did, I think that can be a really powerful learning tool to go, hey, and a good example, when we last saw each other, I was in a situation where I wasn't emotionally handling what was going on for my circumstances very well at all. And that was one of the reasons I moved here. I was in a situation going, I'm not handling this. And this is not the hardest thing that's going to happen in my life. So if I can't handle this, when the real hard thing comes, I'm screwed. So that was one of the reasons I moved here, was going, okay, I'm not going to go back to something comfortable because that bred the man that couldn't handle this. I'm going to put myself in a situation where I'm going to be forced to become more resilient, more capable, have more capacity, so that when life truly does throw a challenge at me, I'm going to be able to handle it and I'm going to be okay. And I think that that's, if we can change this framing that we're having of being like, I was wrong, I made a mistake, I'm scared, I don't like this scenario, to be like, I made a mistake, I'm going to learn from it. And this time, if it comes around again, I'm going to respond in a way that I'm proud of. I think that can be a very nice conscious shift that facilitates positive change.
Yeah, another thing I see I just occurred to me in terms of looking evil in the face. Uh, if you think about the most archetypal or universal story that we have, it's the hero's journey. It's it's in all cultures, these archetype of the hero. And look at all our Hollywood movies, in Marvel movies. It's the most common theme is that the hero, there's a hero and there's a villain and there's an ordeal and there's an outcome and there's a prize. This kind of archetypal story. And I think the mistake people make is that they always or mostly identify with the hero. So I have this concept in that I've come up through doing shadow work is that you're both the hero and the villain. That's the whole idea of there being a villain in the story as well. But we've fallen for the mistake of only identifying with the hero. So we don't see the villain in ourselves. And so if you don't see the villain in yourself, you're unlikely to see the villain in others. And this is why I think shadow work is essential. And that's how I discovered the monster and the beast in me. And when I did that, I'm like, oh, I get it. There's a beast or a monster in all of us. And that this makes it more likely for me to see the evil that man is capable of. I mean, all this stuff that's being done is man against man. When I say man, I include women in that. And so the a mistake that we make is that we put too much emphasis on our persona, the part of ourself that we like and that we're happy with, and we don't turn and face our shadow, our darkness. We either we're afraid or we don't have the stomach for that. And so for this reason, I think people are naive. They don't see the villain in them, and so therefore they think that others aren't villainous either. And so I think that's another part of the antidote is to um, be able to see that side in yourself. There's a line in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book. This happened in Stalinist Russia, where he said that the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. And so I think one of the ways for us to fight tyranny is to be able to see the tyranny in ourselves, to see the tyrant in us. And yeah, so I don't know how that relates to the head in the sand, but it's something like um, I can't see the evil out there because I'm unwilling to see it in myself. And I think that willingness to look at the darkness within is a protective mechanism for you to be able to summon that forth if ever you're confronted by a real villain.
Mm.
Does that make any sense to you? I'm just rambling now.
No, it does. And I was reflecting, in the time that we spent together, I can't remember how long it was, but I learned a lot from you, both in terms of what we spoke about, but then also seeing the other things that you kind of speak about and you teach, which is why I refer so many of my clients to you. I often say that Pete's the only person I've ever taken advice from, so you should probably speak to him. And I think one of the things that you taught me a lot in this concept is that, and this is what I try to teach my clients a lot. I see in a lot of people that they either see themselves as like, I'm okay, I'm good, I've got my shit together, or there's something wrong with me, I need a clinical diagnosis, I need medication, I'm a head case. And I think one of the most important things that people can realize is that we are all flawed. Like, we are all flawed. And it's such an important thing to be able to recognize and honor and understand that and go, there's something here that is not as good as everything else. There's something here that's off. There's something here that's defective. There's something here but none of that's necessarily bad. It's just part of a flaw in being a human. And the phrase that I often come back to, which I think I learned from you, is that there are these things that we have to make room for. And I think that this is an important, lesson that people can learn in this, is that, like, it's okay to have been wrong about some stuff, and it's okay to have these issues coming up, and it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. And the advantage and the approach that I like about what you have is that you look at that stuff, you see it, and then you go, well, this doesn't serve me, this is there, this is not going away, and this is the stuff that I need to change, look at differently, and overcome. And one of the best things I did, through the processes that I've been through, many of which you were around for, was recognizing in my circumstances that a whole bunch of the problems I was having with other people and the circumstances in my life were my own flaws, just as a mirror, just reflecting back on me. And that's an ugly thing to realize. And it's like, oh, but I think some people can look at that and then react and go, oh, I'm the problem, everything's wrong with me, and go from one end of the extreme to the other. But then just looking at that and going, okay, that's the stuff I need to work on. That's the stuff I need to recalibrate. That's the stuff that I need to address so that it doesn't show up again. And it's okay that that stuff happened, because I only knew what I knew at the time, and I'm not perfect. And I think this is where, when people are listening to stuff and they find things confronting, and they don't like hearing a certain thing, there's a tendency to shut off and go, no, 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 I want to stay in my bubble where I'm good and everyone else is the problem. But I think that the only path forward for growth, if you don't want the same things to reoccur again, is going, hang on, I'm the common denominator in all the things that's gone wrong in my life. And that's just objective fact. So what responsibility and change can I make for this so that I can become more like the person that, like, I remember being in the situations being like, who do I need to go to? Who's the person who could help me? Who's the person who could guide me? And I went, he's not there. Maybe I need to become him. I need to become the man I needed, not the man who needs him. And when you realize and take accountability for that, I think that's when the doors really open for this development into becoming someone that is still flawed, but that you're at peace with and proud to be.
Yeah, great. I like that, Dave. I think if I had one piece of advice, it's identify what your weaknesses are, or your flaws, and then put all your energy, effort, and attention on working on those weaknesses. I think people focus maybe putting too much attention on their strengths. Your strengths are fine; they don't need work. It's where you're weak you want to be working. I think we need to wind it up just in terms of time constraint, Dave. I could talk, of course, to you for a lot longer. Uh, Thanks for being a guest on the show. So if any of my listeners wanted to find you, it's daveleecoaching.com. Is that right?
So my website is advancedfundamentalhealth.com, and people can find me on there. I've got a few ebooks. I've got a whole list of all my free lectures on YouTube. There's over 100 videos people can watch. And then, just like yourself, I've got an academy on School that if people want to have connection to me, Q&As, see the years of content that I've written, they can join that from that website too. And then I do have a wait list until early next year. But if people do want to work with me one on one, they can book via the website. And if anyone is looking to get treatment for testosterone replacement in Australia, or just inquire about the process and how it would look and how it would work, my clinic is called Primal Zone, so primalzone.com. And it might be .com.au actually. Put it into Google, it'll come up. And we can guide you and help you through there. And then I will be managing anyone's case for a review personally that comes through there as well.
Yeah, great, Dave. What I want to acknowledge you for one aspect of your masculinity, and you demonstrate most of the traits of masculinity, but you're in service to others, and particularly men who are having struggles and challenges. And I think that's another aspect of the masculine, is that they're not all about themselves. They're not self-serving. And that I see that in you, and I see that in me and others, where that, sure, I like to take care of myself, but I'd like to take care of others as well, and to have my attention on one. So I want to acknowledge all the great work you're doing in your space. Some of your clients have come across to me. They rave about the success that they've had through working with you, and then they come to me for other work. Thanks for being a guest on the show, Dave. Great to reconnect with you, and yeah, maybe I'd love to have you on again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. As I often say to my clients, you're the one who inspired me to do what I do now. So it's great that you're doing stuff online. I was very happy when I saw that you're doing online offerings and you're doing the podcast and the academy. I think it's awesome because you were very pivotal and fundamental in a two probably quite difficult periods in my life, which I came through as very positive catalysts, and I probably wouldn't have been able to integrate them as well if it wasn't for your guidance through that period. So, yeah,
Uh,
thank you for taking the time. I'd love to be back on again, and I think it's great that you're putting all this stuff out there, and also that you've become a father. I think that's awesome.
Oh, great, Dave. Yeah, that's the best thing that ever happened to me, was becoming a father. I recommend it, Dave.
Good. There's plenty of people who have kids who shouldn't have kids, but I think you're someone who should have kids. So that's good.
Likewise, Dave. All right. Thanks so much. I'll see you later.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye, Dave.